Welcome back. This is part 3 of Biblical Archaeology from the Ground Down, part 2. So part 2 has A, B, and C. C should be our final one on this. We've been talking about the Exodus, and the Exodus is a watershed, a benchmark of biblical history, biblical chronology, if we can set it, or at least attempt to set it, or where we set this date. Makes all the difference for the conquest, all the difference for patriarchs, everything that we would place, say, prior to the time of the United Monarchy would be set upon really the date of the Exodus. There are three main views that I think we've mentioned earlier, but I'll just recap it here. One view would say that the Exodus didn't happen at all. There was no Exodus. And therefore, how did the people of Israel get there, get to Israel? They would say it's a migration, and it would be a migration from Mesopotamia into the hill country. And was no Exodus. They were never in Egypt. And they would discount everything in the Old Testament that speaks of that as just being something that was created, legend, I guess, or stories of origin. For people who take the text seriously about the Exodus and believe it actually happens, there are two main positions. One is the late date of the Exodus, and the other is the early date. The late date of the Exodus would place the Exodus at about 1220, 1230, somewhere in that neighborhood. The early date would place it around 1447, 1446, using a date in Kings about the dedication of the Temple of Solomon, and maybe I'll talk more about that later if you have questions about it. Anyway, we have to make a lot of decisions when we listen to what people say about the date of the Exodus, because they are making many decisions or assumptions when they speak about it. When they say, for example, these assumptions, that one of the assumptions is their dating of the Exodus and the Conquest, late date, early date, or it didn't happen at all. The other is where they're dating these particular sites, evidence that a site is the biblical site. In other words, what happened at Jericho and how do we date it? This is based upon the ceramic material, and there are debates over how to date some of these ceramic materials. So it's not as cut as dry as some might make it out to be. Another question then is are we excavating the right site? In other words, the site that we think is Jericho, I think most people agree is Jericho. However, the site of Ai, or Et Tel, some people have questioned whether the excavation of Et Tel really is Ai. Could be a site nearby, that sort of thing. So evidence that the site is the site of the Bible, this is part of the question. Then I think another important thing to remember is how much of that particular site has been excavated. In the case of Et Tel, for example, a very small percentage of the site has been excavated, and in fact, most archaeological sites, a very small percentage of the site has actually been excavated. So a lot of the decisions that are made, it says, well, this site definitely doesn't have any material that relates to the Exodus, let's say. They're basing it upon an excavation of a site that they assume is the site that's in the Bible, and it's based upon information of a date that they assume is the date of the Exodus and the Conquest. And it's also based upon the fact of an excavation of a site like Et Tel, how much has been excavated, where maybe, I don't know exactly for Et Tel, but I'd say it's probably about 20% of the site has been excavated. That's probably generous, but well, let's say it is 20 or 25%. So let's say 1/4 of the site's been excavated. That means there's 75% of the site that's not been excavated that might actually have other evidence in it. So I think that's something to keep in mind. This is part of what, when I began with those Yamauchi circles of evidence, how many sites have been, how much is preserved at the site, how much of the site has How many sites have actually been found, identified? How many sites have been excavated? How many sites, what percentage of the site has been excavated? How many of those sites have actually been published? And how much of that material has been published? I mean, there are still people waiting for information of excavations that were finished in the 1970s, and it still has not been published. And a lot of Kathleen Kenyon stuff of Jericho, which was much earlier than that, it was in the 60s, has never been published, and quite frankly, probably never really will be published, because what tends to happen with archaeologists is they're much more eager to excavate than they are to publish. And, I'm probably guilty as charged on that. I mean, I enjoy excavating. I don't enjoy publishing as much. Why? For a large measure, at least for me, and I think probably it holds true for some other archaeologists as well, especially those who work in, say, Israel and Jordan and the Near East. No one pays us to excavate. In fact, it usually costs us money to go. And so we have to have a job that enables us to go and excavate. So in other words, it's not our full-time job. We have to excavate when we are teaching classes. And when we get back, we have teaching duties, we have committees, we have all sorts of other things that take up our time. So it makes it very difficult then to really put the time into it, analyze things, and then get them published. I guess that's not an excuse, but it is an explanation. Well, anyway, let's move on. Larry Steger and others have a view of the conquest. As I said, there's three views: early date, late date, and then some say it didn't happen at all, that really the conquest, they put it in quotes, is just a settlement or a migration. The Israelites moved from Mesopotamia and they settled in the hill country of Canaan. They hold that there is an Israel present, at least a group of people called Israel present, by say 1200 BC, because of Merneptah stele we talked about earlier. They believe Israelites then, some believe that they were most likely indigenous people. So some people say they moved from Mesopotamia. Other people say they're the indigenous people of the hill country, and that when the Philistines and others moved out on the coast, then they got themselves into trouble. So some of them actually identify the Israelites as the Canaanites. So they're the same people. So in the Bible, they're described as being two different people. And then those who live in the hills sort of develop their own identity and start to call themselves Israelites. Here's one of the gods of the Canaanites, Baal or Baal. So the Israelites then, in quotes really, settle in the low country or the hill country with a low population, have several groups or tribes. They're farmers, they're shepherds, whatever. They see themselves as being different from the other tribes or groups of Canaanites, and therefore they start to call themselves something else. So this is, I guess, a variation of the theme, there was no Exodus. One is it's a migration from Mesopotamia, but this one's saying that they're just Canaanites who happen to live up in the hill country, kind of like I live in the hills of Kentucky, and we identify ourselves perhaps differently than people who live in the big city. So we're different than them. So the Israelites are different, change their name. Early Israelite archaeological evidence. Well, really, it's true, and again, part of this depends on the chronology that you do, but we don't see a big cultural change when people move, when, for example, the Israelite period takes place in Palestine. The pottery doesn't really change much. The houses don't change much. And so the idea then is, can we really tell a person's ethnicity from their material culture? What's going to let us know that it's something different? Well, there can be some changes in pottery, some changes in house styles. We might find some evidence of change of religion. For example, if we're finding pork bones or pig bones in an excavation, and we say, well, those aren't Israelites. Why? Because they wouldn't eat pork. That sort of thing. We also do find some cultic remains of, say, standing stones or or statues of Baal, or that sort of thing. But this is a real connection between material culture and the culture of the people. So this whole idea then of ethnicity is really what gets talked about here. Deaver writes a book about it. Finkelstein says we can't determine ideology, ethnicity from the archaeology. Deaver says we can. And so the video goes into some of this, and I'll let you read some of that. And Deaver then launches into a talk of popular religion. And basically, they try to say basically that there is no distinctive, I guess, Israelite religion, that it's really a mixture of religion that we might call Judaism and the Canaanite religions. And of course, in the Bible, there are many mentions of standing stones and Ashtoreths and Baal and those sorts of things. And they find a lot of statues, like you see pictured here, of fertility goddesses that are associated with Astarte. The question is then, what can we tell about the people that had this material? And here are just some passages that speak about it. I'm not going to do that. You know, Deaver even wrote this book, Did God Have a Wife? And I think basically his answer is yes. He believes God did have a wife, that Yahweh had a consort. And part of this he bases on a couple of inscriptions. One is a tomb inscription at Khirbet El Kom, and then a second one. And I just put some of the information here because I go over this very quickly in the video. But here's Khirbet El Kom inscription. You can see what it says, and you can see what it looks like. Notice it says Yahweh and by his Asherah. The question is, you know, obviously there were people who were not following the religion carefully. The prophets rail against this, and so was this the typical thing or atypical? Here is another site he mentions, Ajud, the inscription with the figures. These figures, they say, are figures of Bes, which is a sort of fertility god to help women in pregnancy in Egypt. I have blessed you by Yahweh, by Samaria, and by his Asherah. So Deaver and others then believe that the culture and religion are in flux until the period of the monarchy and the building of the temple, and so that all that is sort of oral history and in that way, and that they really worship many pagan gods, and they weren't really what the prophets were talking about was something that they did all the time. Then another question has to come: can we tell the difference between the Israelites and the Philistines? Some are easier to tell apart than others. And some of this they're using the bones. You can listen to the video about that. So what did it mean to be an Israelite? This is a question Larry Steger talks about in the video, and I'll let you look that over as well. So most scholars today, according to Shanks, accept that Israel emerged was far more complex than it was in the Bible. And of course, Finkelstein is quite critical of the biblical text. Then the end of this video kind of tags on the end a lot of new archaeological techniques like underwater archaeology or marine archaeology. The idea then they talk about working in the lab and how we have to put in much more time in the lab really than we would in the field. And from burials and so forth, we can tell quite a bit about them. They talk about archaeological survey, which I have here. I'll let you look that over, which is basically picking up things on the surface. This is a map of a site where I've worked in Jordan. And then sort of what is in the name. And Bill Deaver has railed against using the name biblical archaeology, and he wants Syro-Palestinian archaeology. But I think the value of biblical archaeology is this: we can get to know the way they lived. We can get an idea of their houses, the weapons, the tools, the lamps. We can see the streets where they walked. We can read some of the documents they were familiar with. We can see some of their sacred items. And I think it adds a great depth to our biblical studies, and much more will be added in the future. All right, we'll leave it there for now. Have a good day.